and I'm quite excited about today's chat because we can literally talk about ghosts as much as I like.
We can. I spend my life talking about ghosts, so I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, there is this stigma, isn't there, attached to ghost stories, and there is this kind of, broader spectrum of like, oh, you saw a ghost, haha, ghosts, oh, they're so funny, you must be crazy. And I think it is difficult to kind of come forward sometimes and tell your truth, because you're going to open yourself up to a lot of people who think you're absolutely nuts.
I think it's a really good point.
But to actually say, I genuinely believe in ghosts, or there's definitely just something that happened that I can't explain, and there's an entity there. Yeah, I think when you add the ghost word, it almost makes it comical.
The G word scares people.
Yeah.
But met a group of people sitting around the circle, top room of a pub, who believed they'd had UFO experiences. Okay. And one of the lines that really stuck in my head was a guy said, it makes you feel like you are the alien. You can't talk to other people about this. You can't.
Well, I had those thoughts, this is going to ruin my life. This is going to ruin my career. I'm not going to be able to show my face in public again. Something
that's magical and mysterious and wonderful, and it may possibly be the dead coming back to life. It might be, the closest we get to time travel. Not us traveling back to the past, but the past coming to us. I often say that the ghost stories that we want to hear are scary, but the ghost stories we want to experience are comforting.
Why is it always this glamorized, like, this beautiful, stunning woman in this swooping white dress? Why is it not like Bob from Outside Wetherspoons with his tinny in his hand?
I have to say, I've been told some great ghost stories about very ordinary people. The other night we were told a story about a hoodie ghost, and there's a great one in Brighton that we found when we went there, which was about Angry Mick, who's this spirit of this big overweight bloke with a beer belly who's in the Churchill shopping centre and runs into people and bashes into them. And on the CCTV cameras, you see this person being thrown to one side, and sometimes these people have bruises, I think, but you can't see Angry Mick. He doesn't appear on the camera.
But apparently this is supposedly haunted by a lady in the balcony or something or other, but don't say that.
That was just fine. It's just an usher. Don't worry.
That was such weird. That was weird timing, but it was an usher. I'm here with the wonderful Danny Robbins, and I'm quite excited about today's chat because we can literally talk about ghosts as much as I like.
We can. I spend my life talking about ghosts, so I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, I know. And I think as well, I'm kind of fascinated because a lot of your world, as you've so perfectly pointed out, revolves around paranormal activity and talking about ghosts. So where did this kind of interest in the paranormal begin for you?
Good question. And I've had to think about this a lot recently because I've just found myself writing a kids' book about ghosts. And basically, for me, it does go back to that era, being really quite young and reading books about ghosts in my school library, particularly things like the Usborne World of the Unknown book about ghosts, which I think a lot of people who grew up around the same time as me, that's where their interest in ghosts started. I think for my memory of my interest in ghosts, it begins with very strong visual images.
Yeah.
Kind of the brown lady of Raynham Hall image of this kind of ghostly figure standing on a staircase. Was that a ghost or not? Was it a trick of the light? And there was that image of a woman who'd spontaneously combusted. Do you know the one I'm talking about there?
I actually don't know.
Oh, really? This is a kind of classic image that haunted people who grew up in the kind of 70s and 80s, I think, of a woman's leg, a sort of charred remains of someone. People watching might know that. But there were certain images that kind of haunted me and stuck with me, I think. And then my interest grew and developed from there. But I think also I was brought up in a belief-free household. I was brought up by a very atheist mum who had been a Catholic but stopped being religious. And I think I was just fascinated by belief and what made people believe. And I think for me, that's still a massive part of this, about what is it about these experiences that makes us believe? Why do you believe in a ghost? Because belief without evidence is crazy, but when you have evidence and you feel like you've seen a ghost, then that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm intrigued by these experiences that change people's perceptions of our world.
Yeah, and you touched upon evidence there, and I think obviously a lot of ghost hunters, a lot of paranormal enthusiasts spend their life searching for evidence, but I often wonder, what would evidence even look like? What would, are you actually a believer in ghosts was a first question that would lead to what I'm about to ask next.
Well, I don't know would be the simple answer to that. I mean, I would love to believe in ghosts, and I feel like I spend a lot of my time trying to prove their existence. So clearly I have real skin in the game of wanting them to exist. I think it's the most magical, wonderful idea of this mystery, this greatest mystery in the history of the universe really coming true and being real. What would it take? I think that's a really hard question in this day and age.
I think it's...
We live in an era of AI and fake news and bots and all these kind of things. And I think, people often ask me, why in the era of the smartphone have we not got a photograph of a ghost or a video of a ghost? I'm like, well, there's loads. If you go out on the internet, you'll see loads and loads of things that people claim to be capturing paranormal activity on camera. And actually, we don't trust any of them. You could show me the most convincing video and I'd say, well, that could just be AI.
I have a theory that sort of belief in something like ghosts and paranormal does lead back to a very personal experience. And I think that for me, what made me believe in ghosts was having a very personal paranormal experience. But because before that, I was very, very fascinated. We've all been there as a child listening to ghost stories, like being transfixed by the whole aesthetic of it. But what does it actually take for you to be convinced? And I think for a big part of it, you have to feel something or see something yourself. And then how do you prove that to someone else? Because, if you came up to me and you told me the best ghost story, like, oh, I experienced this last night in my hotel, and I'd be like, oh, that's really great. And I'd give you the benefit of the doubt, but then I wouldn't know whether you were lying or whether you were drunk or whether you were having some crazy trip. So how do you prove that to someone?
I think it's really hard. And I think one of the most convincing things for people who believe they've had a paranormal experience is a feeling. And it's the one thing you can't prove. You can't show someone a feeling, they can't hear it. It's not tangible. But so many people speak to me about this intense feeling of a presence, of something in their house. And that is the thing that convinces them, So, yeah, I don't know. Feelings are powerful. And I guess we have to sort of trust our feelings and go along with it. But at the same time, anybody from a skeptic background will tell you about why we have feelings in certain situations and about how our brains can absolutely trick themselves. So it's tricky, isn't it? But I'm in this very privileged position now, traveling around the country at the moment, doing my Uncanny Tour and hearing people's ghost stories. Every single night, this theatre is full of people telling me their ghost stories. People, tell them out loud in the theatre, and it has this really powerful, I sort of feel like almost semi-religious quality to it. It's an amazing thing of people sharing these things. But people share these moments that, on paper, are utterly impossible, and yet they are clearly so affected by it, and that is very affecting. But then also, in many cases, there's somebody else who's had this experience. There are multiple witnesses, multiple people sharing this moment, and that makes it much, much harder to explain.
Yeah, and I think as well with highly haunted locations, there will be the same sort of apparitions appearing in the same spots, and you just think, well, hold on, so many people have seen this. And then you kind of go, well, so many people know about it, so they're looking for it.
Yeah.
So is that sort of tricking their mind into, I saw, if there's a famous ghost of a lady in a black dress and you see some sort of shadow, then in your mind, instead of logical reason, you're going, oh, that was the lady in the black dress. So it's such a fascinating, like almost psychological, I suppose,
well,
parts
totally,
of it.
Yeah. What we call priming, about when you go into a situation expecting something and then it happens. You're kind of, it's the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, there's a famous ghost story about the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, where we performed, about the smell of lavender, which is said to be associated with Dan Leno, who was this famous performer there, who was the first ever pantomime dame, and he's said to have worn this lavender perfume. And I spoke to someone, an actress who'd been on stage there, and said that she smelled this lavender just as she was about to go on stage. And it's meant to bring you good luck as a performer. But of course, if you're a performer in a theatre in a state of nerves,
you'd be like,
exactly, the one thing you want is good luck, isn't it? So you'd be saying, come on, bring on the lavender, where is it? So I think there are certain situations where we definitely go looking for things and we want things to be true. But, the experiences that intrigue me and the ones that I find myself telling the most in my programs are the ones that happen to people who didn't want it to happen and who had no expectation of it. The story I keep going back to is the first ever episode of the Uncanny podcast, about this hall of residence bedroom in Belfast, room 611. And this guy, Ken, who was an eminent geneticist, this kind of real bastion of science. And he doesn't believe in ghosts, but he thought he had a ghost experience. And then he discovered that people the year before and the year after in the same bedroom had also had it. And suddenly you're in this situation where you find yourself talking to multiple people, all of them intensely rational scientists who don't believe in ghosts, and who all had what they believe is well, at least, maybe they don't believe it's a ghost experience, but they believe it's an experience that cannot be explained. It is literally paranormal. It is outside the normal. Yeah. So those are the experiences that fascinate me. I love those, when you get someone whose whole worldview is exploded and punctured by what happened.
It's so funny how we kind of rationalize it, like, oh, well, it was a scientist, so he must be telling the truth about this encounter.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think people generally do there is this stigma, isn't there, attached to ghost stories. And there is this kind of, broader spectrum of like, oh, you saw a ghost, haha, ghosts, oh, they're so funny, you must be crazy. And there is that sort of stigma about it. And I think it is difficult to kind of come forward sometimes and tell your truth, because you're going to open yourself up to a lot of people who think you're absolutely nuts.
I think it's a really good point. And I think hopefully one of the things that Uncanny has done is created a safe space where people can talk about it. And I get a lot of emails from people who say, I've never talked to anyone about this before, and in many cases not even talked to their partner about it. I had a really powerful one recently where I spoke to a guy and I said, who have you told about this before? And he was like, no one, not even my wife. I don't know how I'd talk to my wife about it, but he felt able to talk to us on the podcast about it, which is amazing, really. But I think you're so right. I don't think we're very kind to people who've had paranormal experiences now. It used to be front page news in the days of Borley Rectory, right back in the kind of 20s to 40s, or even, the Enfield haunting days in the 70s. This was big news. It was dealt with on, major news programs. It was, in newspapers. And then I think there was an era of a certain kind of paranormal television, which was really fun, but actually turned the paranormal into something that was kind of slightly pantomime entertainment, And I think that has seen a shift, I think, in the way it's viewed. And I think there's a lot of people who maybe didn't feel comfortable sharing their stories in that format, in that forum.
I think that the interesting thing, on the surface level, it is still sort of humorous, and you will get the sort of broader society. But when you dig a little bit deeper, I don't think that it's as frowned upon and as laughed upon as people think. And the more, of course, you have the surface people on the internet who are like, oh, you're a loon, have you taken your meds? But when you delve a little bit deeper, there are a whole community of people who have, this is the community that comes to see your shows that are fascinated in it.
Well, I would also say a lot of people who didn't realize how interested they were in ghosts. I often find people coming up to me and going like, I never knew I was this fascinated by this subject. This is great. Because it opens up so many different avenues. And I found this, writing my kids' book now, I've found that, it takes you into science and history and the way our universe works, the way our bodies work, the way we process things, psychology. It's so many different things. And you can enjoy these stories as a skeptic. You don't have to believe. You can enjoy the detective story as a skeptic. But I definitely think, the other night I sat here and I said to this full auditorium, hands up if you think you might have had a paranormal experience. And so many hands went up. And that's a very different question to, do you believe in ghosts? Have you actually had one yourself?
It's quantifying what that encounter is, and then sort of going one stage further and not dismissing it to some sort of something you can semi-explain, but to actually say, I genuinely believe in ghosts. Or there's definitely just something that happened that I can't explain, and there's an entity there. I think when you add the ghost word, it almost makes it comical.
The G word scares people. But I think, not being afraid to talk about it. I think, so many people have bottled these things up and not talked about them, and it kind of festers, and you find yourself, it's an itch you can't scratch. And, I remember very clearly, actually, I mean, it's, sort of slightly tangential, not quite ghosts, but UFOs. I went to a support group in Todmorden, this place that has a huge number of UFO sightings, a real UFO hotspot. And I went up there for my book and met a group of people sitting around the circle, top room of a pub, who believed I'd had UFO experiences. Okay. And one of the lines that really stuck in my head was a guy said, it makes you feel like you are the alien. You can't talk to other people about this. You can't articulate it. And if you do, they maybe laugh at you or they look at you as if you're crazy. And, and I think, all paranormal experiences are like that. I think they make you other, paranormal means outside the normal. They make you outside the normal. And I think it's, that's a perception, but I think there's so many more people out there who think they've had experiences, or certainly kind of think that it's possible that people can have experiences. And I think the only way to make sense of these things is to talk about it. It's so important.
I think as well, for me, talking about it was such a fundamental, life-changing moment. And before I did that, I had those thoughts, this is going to ruin my life. This is going to ruin my career. I'm not going to be able to show my face in public again. And you have those moments where it's just like, what am I doing talking and being so open about this? And then you get past it and you realize that it's a story that needs talking about. And it's like you said, if you can be a figurehead for those people who want to come forward, it sort of normalizes it. And of course, no one can say 1,000,000, 100% that was a ghost and here's the evidence. But I still think the actual topic of it is so fascinating. And I get to travel the world now. I get to talk to people like yourself. I get to talk to psychic mediums, and everyone's encounters are so fascinating. And it's just opened up this amazing world. So I definitely think we should keep talking about ghosts.
And I think maybe the question is not do ghosts exist, but what are ghosts? People are having these experiences in quite large numbers and have been for thousands of years. And I think maybe we need to look more at what this is. And the answer is quite possibly something within our own mind, something psychological or something environmental. But the answer is also possibly, that it's something that's magical and mysterious and wonderful. And, it may possibly be the dead coming back to life. It might be, the closest we get to time travel, not us traveling back to the past, but the past coming to us. And I think, that possibility, even, however slim a possibility you believe that to be, that possibility is wonderful and worthy of investigation.
Yeah, no, I think it is absolutely fundamentally fascinating. And it's like that thing. Also, the thing that I was kind of going to go back to is, I was speaking to a psychic medium, and it's not just the apparition of ghosts that people see. It's like you touched on earlier, it's the sensing, it's the multi kind of sensory thing that can completely affect your body. So it's not just that sort of comical thing of seeing a figure in a doorway that looks like a Victorian soldier. There's often smells attached. It's like a multi-sensory thing that can affect your body. You can sometimes feel the presence of a ghost. You hear loads of people saying they walk into a room and it goes cold and there's a breeze and there's a draft. And it's like, what is that? And I think the fact that there's something else on the other side of life is quite comforting for a lot of people.
Well, yeah, and comfort's an important word, isn't it? I think I often say that the ghost stories that we want to hear are scary, but the ghost stories we want to experience are comforting, and it's that thing of maybe not being able to choose the ghost you see. I've heard people say before, that they wish they could have seen the ghost of a parent or a sort of someone close to them they lost, and instead they had a frightening experience. But actually, the most powerful stories, certainly that we hear on the tour, are always the ones that connect to somebody lost, and it's deeply moving. It's incredible, these kind of moments where your universe shifts, your kind of life-changing moments, because you suddenly feel you have that kind of contact with someone that you really cared about. And that's the experience you would wish upon people, isn't it? That's the one that all of us dream. And I think, we've all got skin in this game. The idea of death is frightening to human beings. Death being a finite end seems so horrible and so meaningless, doesn't it? That we sort of spend all of our lives building up this stock of experience and communicating and kind of creating all these amazing things, and it just stops. Is such a horrible idea that I think all of us secretly, even if you don't believe in ghosts, you secretly want them to be real because of that idea of something more, life beyond death.
I actually think that that's the most scary part of the whole thing of believing and seeing spirits is the close personal connection to a loved one. And it's one thing talking about seeing the ghost of someone you've never met, a Victorian soldier, like a woman in a black dress. But when it kind of comes to someone feeling that they've sensed like their grandfather or like a child that's been lost, I think that's the area of the kind of paranormal world that scares me, because I feel that's the area where most people are open to feeling slightly exploited. Like you go to a psychic medium.
Right, okay. Yeah.
I mean, that kind of springs to mind when someone says, oh, I saw a dead relative, and you'll go into these situations where there's a psychic going, oh, your lost child's walked in. And that's the area that I don't really like, because I find that quite hard.
No, that's a complicated area. And I think that's, it's hard. I mean, when we want something so badly, we do make ourselves vulnerable for those who would prey on us. And it's a conversation we have a lot on Uncanny, I guess, how we feel about that whole idea of mediumship, of people being able to claim to contact the dead. I mean, I've heard some amazing stories where a medium seems to deliver a message that there's no way they could have known about unless they had some sort of contact, the powerful kind of stuff. But I've also witnessed at firsthand many mediums who are desperately fishing and kind of, who are disingenuous, I feel, But I mean, clearly, any industry can attract both good and bad people. It's so hard to know. My kind of jury is out on whether there is an ability in some people to contact the dead in that way. But certainly, if you're putting yourself in a situation where you are paying money to somebody to contact someone you miss and you lost, then that is a very difficult relationship, because that person's got a lot of skin in the game to kind of keep wanting to take money from you and delivering answers that may not be true.
I think that's the area that makes me feel most uncomfortable, because if that person is not genuine, obviously that is pretty dark. You know, that is sort of harming someone. And although you might say, well, they wanted to hear from their dead relative, there is a psychological effect, you know, from that meeting.
Yeah. And also we've got to ask, you know, in our desire to see ghosts, is that helping us move on by proving that somebody we lost is in a good place and happy and, you know, can comfort you, or is that stopping you from moving on by sort of meaning that you can't get past that relationship because you're sort of locked in trying to contact them? So I think, you know, that there are positives and negatives to that idea of contact with someone that we've lost.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of getting a little bit heavy and a little bit like depressing
It
here.
is. But you know, this is the trouble, isn't it? You know, you can't have ghost stories about death. You know, they go hand in hand.
It's a heavy topic, and also when you feel and sense something, you don't know how the person who's around you or next to you might react to that. It's quite a challenging topic. But
no, it really isn't. I think, you know, one of the things about Uncanny and about the show that we're doing here in the theatre, you know, is that there's a lot of humour in it as well. And I think this is true of my play 222, A Ghost Story, as well. Lots and lots of humour, because I think you do need that. You need the light and the dark. And actually, it could be an incredibly serious subject. There's a huge ability to kind of stare into the darkness of humanity with a subject. But I think it's also an incredibly uplifting and exciting and an interesting subject as well, you know, which takes us down these amazing rabbit holes and delivers these fantastic narratives. You know, human beings love to make sense of the world in stories, don't we? And we love detective stories. We love trying to solve things and, you know, kind of crack mysteries. And I you know, that's why I love this subject. That's what it kind of gives to me, and that's what I enjoy sharing.
But I think as well, like, the funny thing is, like, spirits and ghosts, they do have personalities, so they can sometimes be humorous in their approach and when they show themselves. And it's not all sort of doom and gloom, you know, I'm suffering, can't get through to the other side. Or, I mean, what's your theory on that? I mean, if you could quantify what a ghost is, do you believe that they're sort of trapped somewhere between here and there?
Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I sort of feel like I fluctuate between so many different theories as I hear all the different stories. I don't know. I mean, I've thought long and hard about this. I mean, there's a vision of ghosts which is quite poignant and quite sad, which is of people being locked outside of the fun and kind of looking in on our world, almost like the people who've not been invited to the party.
Yeah, it's sort of like they can't pass over, so they're lingering in this no man's land.
You know, there's another vision of ghosts where, you know, they are everywhere. There's, you know, maybe one right here now and one there, you know, where we're surrounded by all of the dead, but we just only happen to tune into them at certain moments. And maybe ghosts are where that huge, invisible army of the dead around us suddenly becomes visible for a moment, you know? I mean, I think that's an interesting theory. Because one of the things I've always struggled to make sense of is, why do certain people come back as ghosts? Like, why would some rich, posh bloke in a stately home come back?
I always have this conversation with people. Why is it always this glamorized, like, oh, this beautiful, stunning woman in this swooping white dress? Why is it not like Bob from outside Wetherspoons with his tinny in his hand?
So, you know, I have to say, I've been told some great ghost stories about very ordinary people. The other night we were told a story about a hoodie ghost. And there's a great one in Brighton that we found when we went there, which was about Angry Mick, who's this spirit of this big, overweight bloke with a beer belly who's in the Churchill shopping centre and runs into people and bashes into them. And on the CCTV cameras, you see this person being thrown to one side, and sometimes these people have bruises, I think, but you can't see Angry Mick. He doesn't appear on the camera, you know. So there are some quite funny, quite mundane, kind of modern ghost stories.
But I think they're just not as romantic. You know, everyone loves like the romantic ghost story, whereas sort of like Mick sort of on his park bench with his Stella is just not quite as glamorous.
It's very true, but I don't know. I mean, you know, are ghosts everywhere, you know, and we just can't see them? You know, do we walk past them every day and sort of just, you know, kind of ignore them without realizing? You know, or is it about certain moments? You know, there's that theory, the stone tape theory, which and a lot of people kind of certainly get very emotionally invested in, this idea of buildings replaying things, or ghosts being kind of replays. And you know, a lot of hauntings you hear about feel like they make sense on those terms. You know, that idea of a moment in history replaying, possibly because it was such a traumatic or dramatic moment, you know. But I don't know. I mean, I think you could sort of almost drive yourself mad trying to crack all these different theories. I think fundamentally what interests me about the stuff I do is about people, and actually living people. I'm fascinated by the impact of these stories on living people, and kind of the kind of where these experiences come from and how they make us feel afterwards as well. I'm really fascinated by that. I think a lot of paranormal shows over the years have been very fixated on places. You go to a castle or a stately home or a haunted pub and you camp the night there and you try and desperately hope that something will happen. But I love the fact that Uncanny focuses on a very strange moment in a person's life and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, it's sort of telling other people's stories for them and giving them the platform to do so, which is a nice way to look at, rather than kind of all this dramatic, like,
yeah, I mean, I think, one of
cameraman throwing a stone
sort of one of our rules has been no night vision cameras, no screaming, no.
People have seen it so many times before, which becomes a little bit mundane, and then you get cynical of that whole world as well.
I just think there's so much anticlimax as well. I think, if you go and camp the night out in some place that's meant to be haunted, there's a danger of anticlimax, that nothing happens. And then that instantly introduces another danger, which is of pretending things happen. And so many shows, you sort of feel like, if you're week in, week out going to haunted locations, you get caught in a thing where you have to kind of deliver something to your audience. And that's when potentially you get mediums claiming to channel things that aren't happening, or presenters screaming at a draft or a little creaky floorboard. So I think, I don't know. For me, the thing that interests me is those personal experiences, sitting in a room with someone who's had a bizarre, seemingly impossible, potentially paranormal experience, and talking to them about it and helping them make sense of it. And I think, the stories speak for themselves. If you've watched Uncanny, if you listen to the podcast, the story is gripping, engrossing and thrilling and frightening enough that you don't have to kind of start, faking things around it or stuff like that. We bring the stories to life through sound effects on the pod or through these kind of visual, dramatic reconstructions on the TV series. But fundamentally, that is a person describing the strangest, most frightening moment in their lives.
Yeah, it's very personable and it's very watchable. And I kind of struggled with exactly what you were talking about, because I do go into these haunted locations, I do ghost hunts, and there are times where I just have to sit there and be honest with the audience and say, I really didn't feel anything, and I'm not going to pretend that I did. It's supposedly haunted. I'll tell you what other people have felt, but for me, I'm not always going to be running out the door screaming. It just doesn't work like that. I
think that's important. I think people smell BS, don't they? And you've got to have honesty about these things and integrity, I think. And I think there's a lot of people out there fascinated by this subject, but kind of put off by the sort of showmanship of the past, and actually just getting into these amazing stories and asking kind of serious, valid questions about what's going on is the thing to do.
I think it's fascinating, and we're all still learning about this. You could leave here tomorrow, see your first ghost, and then your point of view will change completely.
No, absolutely. And, I find myself often wanting that. I go to allegedly haunted locations. I kind of will something to happen.
I was going to say, this very theatre is supposedly haunted. I don't sense anything, to be honest with you. I'm not going to be running out of the room, but apparently this is supposedly haunted by a lady in the balcony or something or other, but don't say that. That was just
fine. It's just an usher. Don't worry.
That was such weird. That was weird timing, but it was an usher. As we were talking about the balcony.
No, I know. I mean, I've travelled around so many theatres in the UK, and they've all got these amazing ghost stories attached to them. And these are places where magic happens, aren't they? Where you can absolutely believe that the spirits of the past might linger around you.
There's such beautiful buildings, like you said, and there's so much energy here. Like even with the living.
No, totally.
Kind of so I mean, what I was going to say is, obviously you do go to all these haunted places. You go to haunted theatres. Is there one place where you have felt something more than anywhere else? In your opinion, where's the most haunted? Or you're just not on that plane where you're feeling stuff like that?
Well, that's a good question. I could probably, the easy answer I could give you is like somewhere like, I went to this place called Louisbelt, which people who know my show will be familiar with. It's a ruined bothy, a ruined kind of cottage in Scotland in the middle of the Highlands, not near to anything at all. And it's a place with a very strange atmosphere, and it's a place where somebody I met for the show told me about this incredible poltergeist experience that took place 50 years ago when he was a teenager, and he keeps going back to this place to try and make sense of it. And I went back there with him, and it's a place that feels strange. It feels sad. It feels oppressive. It feels odd. It has a kind of certain latent threat to it. And that's certainly somewhere where I felt strange and had experiences that felt odd to me. But actually, if you want to talk to me about when I was most unsettled, it was sitting in the studio for the way we record Uncanny. We record it in like an old working men's club, and we set it up and we record our interviews there. Totally normal place that we filmed it many, many times, but it was sitting opposite this one particular guy, Julian, on series 2, who told us this story, Shadow Man story, that most people who've watched the Uncanny series will probably cite that as being the most frightening episode they've seen. His experiences of describing this Shadow Man figure that he saw, and the way that it kind of seemed to come out of his nightmares into the real world. Other people saw it too. There were multiple witnesses. It seemed to kind of haunt him in a kind of horribly aggressive, supernatural stalker kind of way. I think that's the most frightened I felt, sitting, and it was the impact of talking to him, of looking into the whites of his eyes, hearing the tremble in his voice, feeling the fear he felt, reliving this probably 20 years later. That's the most frightened I felt, I think. And but that was to do with a person again, not a place.
Yeah, it's the emotion of someone else and like sensing that that's genuinely real to them. And I think that's kind of interesting. And the fact that the time's an interesting thing, isn't it? If you can hold on to an experience 20 years later and it's been so impacting in your childhood or in your early life that you're still thinking about it, you're still talking about it as a sort of 50 or 60-year-old, that's quite rare, I suppose.
Totally. I mean, the very first show I made for the BBC was called The Battersea Poltergeist, about this 12-year-long poltergeist case. And the woman I interviewed for that, who was this incredibly compelling witness, was in her early 80s, and it happened to her when she was 15 years old, and it was in the mid-50s, 1950s, and I could still feel the fear in her voice as she talked to me, that little tremble, that little catch in the voice, and it's incredibly affecting, and I think it leapt off off the radio, off the podcast to people, and they could feel it too. And it's still for me fundamentally, like, when people say to me, like, how can you tell if people are genuine? You can do all of the due diligence in the world. You can interrogate people's backgrounds and find out every detail about them and do psychological testing and all these kind of things. And obviously we do all these kind of things, and you try and cross-check everything, and you make sure everything is fact-checked, and you talk to other people around them. But, we are dealing in intangible experiences. You cannot fundamentally prove that person was in a room alone and saw that ghost, But the thing that will always convince me most is just that fear, looking into someone's eyes, fear or emotion, and seeing the impact of it on them, I think. And, it's a powerful thing, and I feel privileged to be in situations where I get to talk to people about that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's nice for you as well that people feel comfortable to get that vulnerable and to open up that. So it is a powerful thing. And I was going to say, this is quite a lighthearted question considering what we were talking about. Do you find that people are more skeptical in certain areas? Because
of the country?
Of the country,
yes. Good question.
Because I found that is the case. Some people will find it hilarious, but you were talking about the most impacting place perhaps potentially being Scotland. Then a lot of people up there really take this stuff very, very seriously.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, like, we were in Liverpool the other night for the tour, and I always ask at the beginning, I say, who's Team Skeptic and who's Team Believer? And the Team Skeptic shout was minuscule in Liverpool, really small, particularly that first time. So really big believer city. But I think, Scotland, Wales, the northeast where I'm from, and I think it often goes hand in hand with a lot of sadness and a lot of tragedy. I think areas that have suffered, they process that suffering through ghost stories. When you've got terrible battles or famines or, kind of awful disasters, things that have happened, coal mining disasters maybe, then you process those through ghost stories. And that's either because that's a way of us coping, and so we invent these stories, or it's because literally where there is death, there are ghosts, and so I think there are certain areas that definitely feel more believer heavy, and I guess by that token, other areas more skeptic heavy. I don't know. I mean, I think, my experience generally of traveling around the country is that there are many more people who believe in the paranormal than you expect. And actually, a lot of people don't feel comfortable saying it out loud, but once they get in a room of other people who are also like-minded, then they find it easier to talk about.
Yeah, and I suppose there is some truth in the fact that people are coming to your show because they are interested. I mean, I know you say some people are skeptic, but on the whole, they want to believe in that in some small capacity. So
yeah, I mean, I do sometimes say that even the most resolute skeptic secretly wants ghosts to be real. I think I feel like I've gone on a journey. I think if you listen to the first podcast I did, which was called Haunted, a few years back, I probably getting on for nearly 10 years back, I definitely feel you hear a more skeptic me, and I think you can't hear the kind of stories that I have and the amount of stories I have without it chipping away at you a little bit. And I find myself on a journey, and I definitely would never describe myself as a believer. I'm definitely somewhere in the middle. I feel like I'm sort of torn between the two, but I love the idea of it being real so much.
Yeah, you've actually surprised me because I was expecting you to be a hardcore skeptic and very sort of like, yeah. But yeah, it is a journey. Even for someone like me, it's a journey. And, you know, you start off being terrified by that encounter, and then you talk to so many different people that you get used to it and it's more normalized. And then you kind of learn to live with it and you learn more and your point of view changes. And yeah, 6 months ago, my point of view would have been different. Tomorrow it might be different, but it's still something I want to keep finding out about. And the more people you talk to, the more kind of interesting it becomes.
Yeah, it's exciting. And I think, you know, even people who've had frightening supernatural experiences, I think often talking to them, they wouldn't undo it because of the way it changes your worldview. You know, you become one of a select group of people who's had an experience that is sort of superhuman, if you like, that's kind of outside of normal human experience. And that's an amazing insight. You know, if we believe these experiences are real, if we believe they're genuinely paranormal, then it's an amazing insight to be one of the people who's allowed this little glimpse through into another world.
It's quite funny because I had, actually it was Alice Cooper's daughter who I was interviewing, and she kind of changed my perspective a little bit on ghosts because she was like, oh, I'd be so excited. You know, she was very eccentric. She's like, I'd feel chosen. I'm like, a ghost? You want to talk to me? I'm like, hi, I'm special. And I was like, oh, it is interesting. And then you think, well, why is a ghost making contact with me? Is there a bigger purpose to this? And blah, 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 blah. And it is interesting. And you just kind of flip the way you look at it. Like, it is what it is. And you've got to, you know, things happen for a reason. I intrinsically believe that things happen for a reason. And you are sometimes pushed onto a path. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating world. And thank you so much for talking to me. I could literally sit here and talk to you all day. I have so much. I could talk about ghosts. I could actually talk about anything for a long, long time, but I could talk about ghosts for hours and hours and hours. But as you know, Danny has a show tonight.
I've got to go on stage right now.
He has to go on stage. So thank you so much for your time. And I loved hearing your stories.
Oh, pleasure.
And
thank you, Brocarde.
good luck with the show tonight. I'm going to be watching. So I'm very intrigued. I don't know what to expect. So I'm very intrigued.
There might be a few ghost stories.
Ooh, you think?